Good evening all, a warm welcome. It is with great pleasure and honor that I'm chairing this international scientific conference on Cyprus and the Commonwealth, marking the 60th anniversary of Cyprus' accession to the Commonwealth. The conference is co-organized by the School of Law of the University of Nicosia and the Institute of Commonwealth Studies of the University of London with the support of the Royal Commonwealth Society Cyprus branch. Over the course of today's and tomorrow's deliberations, you will have the opportunity to attend a vast range of scholarly contributions promoting a better understanding of the historical, political, legal, and cultural aspects of Cyprus' participation in the Commonwealth of Nations. Furthermore, the conference is also a cornerstone marking the recent collaboration initiated between the University of Nicosia and the Institute of Commonwealth Studies of the University of London. Dear all, having carefully read the program, I can safely say that the watchword for this conference would be united, together, and forward. That togetherness and that collective ambition to achieve more is both a great aspiration and a great inspiration to us all. The various presentations, discussions, and exchange of ideas taking place over the next couple of days would serve as an engaging learning experience which would certainly enrich our lives. Let this meeting, held in historic Cyprus, a historic country in the Commonwealth, act as a basis for establishing knowledge and education, not only as a priority, but as a core value which will be communicated and transferred to our citizens. Finally, I would like to thank all those who contributed to the successful organization of this conference. Special thanks goes to Dimitrios Kourtis for all his hard work and exceptional professionalism. Once again, I do wish you a very successful conference. Thank you. Now it is with pleasure that I will ask Ben Rawlings, Deputy High Commissioner of the United Kingdom in Cyprus, for his welcoming address. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Kalispera, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for the invite to join you. Now I'm delighted to be in Cyprus's accession into the Commonwealth. A big thank you to the for pulling together such a diverse and impressive lineup of Commonwealth experts, practitioners from the UK, to have what should be a fascinating discussion and look at Cyprus's journey as a member of the Commonwealth family. I hope this will be one of the last times that I have to say not yet the case, but I do congratulate the organisers for adapting to circumstances, embracing virtual ways of working, and for enabling this conference to go ahead. And I'm certain that over the course of the evening and tomorrow, new ideas will be shared across the airwaves and the internet cables, and new contacts and friends we made. Of course, we're not the only ones having to rely on virtual contact, and the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting is one of the latest victims of the pandemic. I hope that the recent in-person G7 meetings that the UK has managed to host safely give us hope that soon our leaders will be able to meet in person in Rwanda. The CHOGM 2021 theme, delivering a common future, connecting, innovating, transforming, feels very apt. And it will build on the key areas that the UK, as the outgoing chair in office, has taken forward over the last 2 years, including on girls' education, trade facilitation, tackling climate change and marine pollution. I do look forward to being able to welcome some of our UK speakers to Cyprus at some point in the future. And I look forward to meeting those of you on the island already, or meeting you again soon in person. The Commonwealth is an important part of our objectives as a diplomatic mission here. And we, together with our friends in the Cypriot High Commission in London, are interested in understanding what more we can do to support and promote Commonwealth themes and promote the Commonwealth as part of the UK-Cyprus relationship. Indeed, last October, just after I arrived in Cyprus to take up this posting, we celebrated the 60 years of the Republic of Cyprus, and therefore 60 years of diplomatic relations between the UK and Cyprus. And as I continue to learn more about the depth and breadth and complexity of our ties as two countries, our shared values, our shared history, our connection through the Commonwealth remains a more powerful thread than I realised it would be. The Commonwealth itself is an institution that continues to unite us, the 52 fellow members, helping us solve or address at least shared challenges. Here in Cyprus, initiatives like the Queen's Canopy Project, working to improve restoration processes at the Amiantos asbestos mine in the Troodos area. The Commonwealth Blue Charter to help protect our oceans, a key issue for the UK and Cyprus as fellow island nations. And lots of other priority issues like the environment, which is very important for us, particularly this year as the UK looks forward to hosting the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow in November. I think our shared membership also allows us to seize opportunities, particularly across areas like technology, innovation, including those linked to green growth. Also public health, which obviously is a major priority at the moment. And the Commonwealth is bringing together our health ministers today and tomorrow to share views and experience on resilient health systems, vaccine programs, an example of the Commonwealth addressing some of the pressing issues that are facing us today. It also offers great opportunities to work together on education, a key aspect of the UK-Cyprus relationship, youth development, something that I'm particularly passionate about, and is a place where we can bring together our huge networks of civil society. And it's in the human elements of the Commonwealth that I'm most struck by its potential to bring us together. Even in my several months here, I've seen some really great examples. Last summer, Her Majesty the Queen naming Nicoleta Polidorou, the founder of Sistema Cyprus, as one of the Commonwealth points of light. I've had the privilege of seeing Sistema Cyprus perform, and it really is excellent. That builds on two previous Cypriot winners of the prize, and Nicoleta, I know, joined a Zoom call with Her Majesty, which was quite something to watch. We've also had Diego Aparicio, who was one of the runners-up in the Commonwealth Youth Awards for his work promoting LGBTI+ rights and founding the Queer Wave Film Festival. We're doing a lot more work on that. Some really good and powerful UK-Cyprus work there, with a powerful potential Commonwealth element. Last summer, we saw the launch of the UK-Cyprus Youth Exchange Programme, another fantastic way to foster new UK-Cyprus links that will last us well into the future, connecting young people and helping them make a positive impact in their communities and their societies. And then the Queen's Essay Competition, the oldest international writing competition in the world, produced 4 winners from Cyprus, with more to come this year too, I'm sure. And that programme is supported by the Royal Commonwealth Society London, and here in Cyprus, we hope to work ever closer to build these opportunities and more. So I'll hand back now to the Commonwealth experts, but I hope that my kind of main message here has come across, that there's a real opportunity in our history as fellow family members of the Commonwealth. There is a real opportunity for the future to bring our people ever closer together, using the Commonwealth's strengths and connections and the shared interests that we have. So I hope you have a fantastic conference. I hope you make some really useful connections, and I look forward to working with all of you and being a part of this as it grows ever stronger in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ben. It is now my pleasure to ask the Dean of the School of Law, University of Nicosia, and the Chair of the Royal Commonwealth Society, Cyprus branch, Professor Achilles Emilianides, for his own welcoming speech. Dear Achilles, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Phellas, my dear Constantinos. I thank the Deputy High Commissioner for his very inspiring speech, and I thank Philip Murphy, my colleague from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. This is the first, and I hope the first of many collaborations between the University of Nicosia School of Law and the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, which is, of course, one of the most renowned institutions in the field of Commonwealth Studies. And Cyprus has benefited a lot from researchers who have studied in the institute and from studies carried out by researchers of the institute also. I would like to begin by thanking a lot of individuals who have helped shape this event. This has been a very long process, a very lengthy process due to the pandemic. We started organizing this conference initially with a view of having it in 2020 and in October, and now we have moved it to May 2021 due to the pandemic. The initial plan, of course, was to hold it as a regular conference where people would meet and greet, but eventually we decided that since this is also the significance of 60 years of collaboration, it would be better to have this as an online conference. Of course, this also allows a lot of opportunities for people outside of Cyprus, which would be the initial hosting venue, to see the event online and even on either live or in recorded form after it is finished. So perhaps this also presents opportunities and not only problems. It's true that the overall situation with the pandemic has changed the way academic institutions carry out their conferences. We hope that we will reclaim some of the physical presence, because it gives the opportunities of dialogue, unlike the virtual ones. But I think we can also take notice of what we have learned during this period about the possibilities of using electronic tools in order to connect to a larger environment. And after all, the notion of the Commonwealth is not restricted to any country. So events regarding the Commonwealth can in this way target audience across the board and across countries, which is a significant thing. Initially, when we planned this, Marinos Papaioakim was the driving force, together with the board of RCS, the Royal Commonwealth Society Cyprus branch, specifically Emilios Solomou, Christina Ioannou, Hera Ioannou, Constantinos Phellas, who is, of course, here, and others. But after Marinos Papaioakim left the RCS for new employment, we have had the pleasure of having Dimitris Kourtis, who has been invaluable in helping set up this conference and helping the organization. I would like to say a few things about the theme of the conference. I think it is important to examine what seems to be the relations between Cyprus and the Commonwealth. It's hard to imagine now, but initially the entry of Cyprus as a Commonwealth member in March 1961 was a rather controversial issue. With a population of less than 600,000 at the time of independence, Cyprus was back then the first small state to join the Commonwealth, an organization in which small states now constitute, of course, a majority of members. So things have changed over these decades. And although it is true that a number of Commonwealth members had adopted Republican constitutions in the years following independence, that includes, for instance, India or Pakistan, Cyprus was actually the first member to achieve independence and join the Commonwealth as a republic. Now, of course, it goes without saying that the majority of members of the Commonwealth are republics. There were two different strikes of controversy back then. Senior government officials in London questioned whether it was in Britain's interest for Cyprus to join the Commonwealth, and doubts had been expressed by some other Commonwealth members as well. Issues like economic and material benefits, like Commonwealth tariff preferences, which would ensure privileged treatment of Cyprus in business transactions, especially with Britain, its most important, obviously, strategic partner at the time, were discussed, taking into account that a quarter of the Cyprus export trade was in 1960s with the UK, and 45% of the imports came from Britain. The possibility to maintain the United Kingdom as an outlet for its citizens was also discussed, and British nationality was considered to be of great value for the Cypriots, since in 1959 there were 60,000 living in UK and about 8,000 in Australia. But also the Commonwealth was viewed as an extra safeguard as well against enosis, in the sense that it would preclude any failings with respect to the implementation of the Zurich and London agreements. However, it should be stated that the most important reasons for members being reluctant to admit Cyprus were the following. First of all Commonwealth countries were to accept the Queen as head of the Commonwealth. However, it was considered that the primary loyalties of the two communities of Cyprus were with countries outside the Commonwealth, namely to Greece and Turkey, and not to the Great Britain and other members of the Commonwealth. The second, as I stated, was that there were no small states back then, and it was considered that the population of Cyprus, hardly exceeding half a million, was not comparable, since at the time New Zealand, as the smallest state of the Commonwealth, had a population of more than 2 million citizens. The other important aspect, of course, was that membership of the Commonwealth implied full freedom in external and defense matters, and Cyprus, because of the Treaty of Guarantee signed between the Republic of Cyprus, the UK, Turkey, and Greece, would have severe limitations with respect to the application of its full freedom in external and defense matters, and this was considered as amounting to a second-class member as opposed to the other members, and this caused some concerns for some Commonwealth members. Also, it was considered that the Cypriot government would not be trusted not to pass information regarding the Commonwealth to Greece or Turkey, who were not Commonwealth members, but with whom the Republic of Cyprus was to have a privileged relation. So it was considered that this might be contrary to the confidential nature of the information given in Cyprus quarters. For Britain, one of the major issues was that Cyprus might become communist, and it was considered that this could become a major nuisance for Britain if Cyprus was a member of the Commonwealth. And also, it was also considered that if Cyprus was admitted as a member of the Commonwealth, other states too small for membership, like, for instance, Malta or Mauritius, or too small, like Southern Rhodesia or Jamaica, might claim the same status. But also, one of the reasons that caused concern for Britain was that British policymakers had spent the past 5 years dealing with EOKA, with the whole situation in Cyprus, with Archbishop Makarios, who was still considered by most in the British seniority circles as a very problematic individual. And this was considered a situation whereby another form of association between the Commonwealth and Cyprus instead of full membership might be more appropriate. This was the one aspect, but on behalf of the Cypriots, there were also concerns, probably even more serious concerns, because at the time, the Cypriots had spent the past 4 years fighting for independence against Britain, and so they were extremely reluctant to see an organization who many considered at the time would be closely associated with the idea of a British Empire. So Colonel Grivas, who was the military leader of EOKA, was in particular adamant that if Cyprus would join the Commonwealth, this would be a reason for the Zurich and London agreements to collapse immediately. So this was considered as a major issue for him, and he raised this issue to Makarios. The issue was raised even during the private meeting the two had in October of 1959, when they tried to reconcile their personal relationship, and they agreed on most issues. But one of the issues that Makarios promised in particular to Grivas that he would consider strongly was that Grivas would not wish for Cyprus to join the Commonwealth before independence under any circumstances. So you can appreciate that the situation was a bit peculiar, and this is the reason why Cyprus did not join the Commonwealth before or immediately after independence, and waited essentially for nearly a year after independence in order to join the Commonwealth. Even at the time when the issue would be discussed, it is striking that the Greek Cypriot deputies agreed only to a 5-year period of the Cyprus joining Commonwealth instead of the Cyprus joining for an indefinite period of time. and there were 9 out of the 35 back then deputies of the Greek Cypriot side who voted against Cyprus joining the Commonwealth, with all 15 Turkish Cypriot deputies, however, voting in favor of Cyprus accession to the Commonwealth. It is striking that the 2 major Greek Cypriot political entities, the Patriotic Front, which was the major one, the one supported by President Makarios, it held that it would only support the accession of Cyprus to the Commonwealth for 5 years, after which the issue would be reconsidered, and that this was a compromise between the 2 views. Whereas for AGEL, which was back then the Communist Party of Cyprus, the position was that the proper position was the withdrawal, immediate withdrawal of Cyprus from the Commonwealth, but that they would accept the compromise of the 5-year admission of Cyprus in the Commonwealth, after which the Cyprus would break ties immediately with the Commonwealth. So this was the situation. This was the situation. It is striking how things changed after Cyprus became a member of the Commonwealth, in the sense that Cyprus actually became a very active and enthusiastic member of the Commonwealth and remains ever since. It hosted the 1993 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. Its foreign minister has chaired the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group. Ministers and governmental officials of Cyprus have participated in all major conferences of the Commonwealth, considering that this is something beneficial. There was no further discussion or reluctance for Cyprus becoming a permanent member of the Commonwealth, nor has there been any discussion after 1961 for Cyprus to leave the Commonwealth. So one might wonder what changed, what happened. And I think there are 2 main issues we should take into account. The first is that the relationships between Cyprus and Britain, although they have had their turbulence over the years, it goes without saying, but in general, the relationships between Cyprus and Britain after independence proved to be very collaborative one and very courteous one. It is clear that Cypriots continued to study in British universities. They continued to have close ties with Britain. They continued to have significant financial and other economic relationships with Britain. So the situation was not the same as after the EOKA struggle ended, in the sense that Cyprus and Britain found ways, even during periods when their relationships might have faced some trouble, they have found ways to continue being very close. The second and very important aspect, however, which I actually think was even more important than the first, is that contrary to what was envisaged in the secret agreements between Karamanlis and Menderes in Zurich in 1959, that Cyprus would become a member of NATO, the decision by Makarios was, as is known, for Cyprus to not join NATO and to become a member of the neutrals. So in this way, Cyprus actually joined the same international alliance as many members of the Commonwealth, in the sense that it became politically alliance with many members of African states, Asian states like India and others, who were prominent members of the Commonwealth, And in this way, this political alliance allowed Cyprus to view the Commonwealth not as a continuation of the British Empire, as was the initial concern of the Cypriot, but as a close union of diverse members from across the globe who have different members. In this way, I think that Cyprus found the Commonwealth as a place where it could belong, and its relationship with other prominent members of the Commonwealth as well, not only with Britain, I think allowed it to become a very active and enthusiastic member of the Commonwealth, as I mentioned before. The other aspect that is very important is that there has been an interesting development with regards to the Commonwealth's membership of Cyprus. When Britain decided to join the EU, back then it was not the EU, of course, it was the European Economic Community, Cyprus decided to have a relationship, an agreement with the European Economic Community for the sole purpose of maintaining its ties with Britain, especially in commerce, because it didn't want to lose its special commercial relationship with Britain. So actually, the reason Cyprus back in the 60s, in the late 60s, decided to apply for an agreement, a bilateral agreement with the European Economic Community was Britain. That's clear. I mean, if you read any documents, any archive from that period, it is clear that the major consideration of Cyprus to join the Commonwealth was the relationship with Britain. So Cyprus indeed joined, had an agreement first with the European Community and started considering Britain within the context of the Economic Community, and this was also a parameter it took into consideration when it applied eventually in the late 80s, early 90s, to become a member of the European Economic Community and eventually the European Union. So after the two poles, the US-led NATO and the USSR-led alliance, stopped being such a primary consideration after the end of the Cold War in the late 80s. And immediately after Cyprus applied to become a member of the European Economic Community, we had, I think, a turn in the sense that whereas in the 70s and 80s, the Commonwealth was extremely important for Cyprus, especially in order to promote commercial interests as well as political interests, especially its views on the Cyprus problem to a large audience of several dozens of countries. After 1990, the situation gradually shifted towards the EU. So Cyprus started losing interest to the Commonwealth and started giving its attention more and more to the EU. And this, I think, culminated in the early 2000s when Cyprus started having the pre-accession negotiations, and eventually in May 2004, it acceded, as is well known, the EU. So after the accession of Cyprus to the EU, and I would say a few years before that as well. It is clear from all relevant press releases, correspondence, academic dialogue, journalist opinions, and so on, that Commonwealth lost its importance in Cypriot public discussion, and EU became the dominant theme. Cyprus, where Cypriots were very eager to prove to be enthusiastic Europeans, as opposed to enthusiastic Commonwealth members, which was the situation a few years back. So now we are in this interesting point of time where we are having not necessarily a new shift, because Cyprus is a member of the EU, so it is not going to lose its interest of being an EU member anytime soon. But we have an interesting situation in that Cyprus, while retaining its EU membership, is starting to show interest again to the Commonwealth for a number of reasons. First, we have had, after 2013, a gradual disappointment of Cypriots' expectations towards the EU, especially after the decision of the Eurogroup to impose a haircut to Cypriot banks. All analysis of sentiments by Cypriots for Europe show that whereas before Cypriots were one of the most enthusiastic member states and felt that they were Europeans above anything else, the situation after 2013, 2014 shows that this has decreased. It's not as if Cypriots don't want to be members of the EU, but they are not as enthusiastic as they used to be. After the decision was taken that the UK would no longer be a member state of the EU, I think Cyprus started showing interest once again to the Commonwealth, not only because of Britain, but because it felt that with Britain not being a member of the EU and being a member of the Commonwealth, this could lead to a new era of importance for the Commonwealth, and so that commercial and political relations with all 53 member states of the Commonwealth would be a great opportunity for Cyprus to consider once again. So we can see that during the past few years, we have had again in Cyprus, after many years, a rejuvenated talk here about the Commonwealth. We have had interest in new commercial relations, in participation, and so on. And I think this is a very interesting point in time, as we will probably have during the upcoming decade new consideration for the relationship between Cyprus and the Commonwealth. So these are some general thoughts about the relationships between Cyprus and the Commonwealth over the past 60 years, but also of what is to come. And on behalf also of the Royal Commonwealth Cyprus branch, where I am the chair, I would like to express my eager enthusiasm for these new relations between the Cyprus and the Commonwealth, since they present a lot of interest, both for people who want to associate with the Commonwealth, but also in my capacity as an academic, they present a lot of interest as well. As per the program, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth will give an address, and so Constantinos, if you allow me, I will conclude my
Thank you so much.
welcome and give you the floor once again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Emilianides, for that excellent trip down memory lane. Welcome, Your Excellency, Baroness Patricia Scotland. Welcome. It is with great honor and pleasure that we have you with us. Her Excellency Baroness Patricia Scotland is the Secretary General of the Commonwealth. And the floor is yours for your introductory address. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And can I say that I was fascinated because I had the opportunity to listen to the professor's analysis of the historical links and how Cyprus migrated from being part of empire to independence and now as an entrepreneurial European looking for fresh horizons. So it's a great pleasure to be able to address you as we gather to make Commonwealth contributions to the celebrations taking place this year to mark the very significant 60th anniversary of the Republic of Cyprus as an independent nation becoming a full member of the Commonwealth family. And in my remarks, you may well find that there are echoes of the professor's analysis, but I can assure you we have not collaborated. So it must be because it's simply the truth. On such a landmark occasion, it is both instructive and I think constructive to look back as you just have been doing, but also to reflect on the journey traveled and the progress made. It's also valuable, I think, as a moment to look to the future and to share our vision and views on how we can move forward towards even brighter horizons of harmony and hope, and of health too, particularly at this present time when we know that the coronavirus is probably at its height, higher than it has ever been at any time before now. And so solidarity and community is hugely important. And the people and the government of Cyprus have made many immensely valuable contributions to the Commonwealth collaboration. And the nation has drawn benefit from its membership over the last 6 decades. The Commonwealth has consistently lent its support to the UN-brokered Cyprus peace talks. And the issue is regularly brought up to the attention and to the consideration of the Commonwealth heads of government meeting and the Commonwealth foreign ministers meetings. Successive CHOGM communiques have reaffirmed full and enduring Commonwealth support for the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and unity of the Republic of Cyprus, and calling for a comprehensive settlement based on the UN Charter and the UN Security Council resolutions on Cyprus. And I must also pay special tribute to the very valuable Commonwealth contributions made over recent years by the present High Commissioner of Cyprus to the United Kingdom, His Excellency Andreas Kakoulis, and his immediate predecessor, each of whom served successively and with exceptional diligence and energy as chair of the Board of Governors of the Commonwealth Secretariat. And in this role, they were responsible for convening the High Commissioners in London of 54 member nations of the Commonwealth, who, on behalf of their respective heads of government, oversee the work and guide the work of the Commonwealth Secretariat as the principal intergovernmental body serving the governments, institutions, and people of our gloriously diverse and inclusive family. Indeed, one of the many distinctive features of the special relationship Commonwealth member countries enjoy with one another is that heads of diplomatic missions who they exchange are known as ambassadors, but that's not how we refer to it in the Commonwealth, as you know. They are all, because they're brothers and sisters in arms, they are all High Commissioners, basically underlining that this is a special familial relationship. However, there is another very distinctive feature of Commonwealth connection and cooperation for which Cyprus paved the way. And because I only listened to about for half an hour of the professor's talk, I'm not sure whether he touched on it, but knowing his comprehensive academic understanding, I'd be surprised if he didn't. So if you've heard this before, just to reiterate, it's because it's true. Because the Commonwealth today is the principal international organization convening and advocating on behalf of small states. Of the world's 42 small states, 32 are Commonwealth members. And it was Cyprus which led the way on this by becoming a full member, as you've heard, in 1961, having obtained independence in 1960. And you'll remember that 1961 was a very special year because Cyprus joined the Commonwealth on the 13th of March, 1961, because she upheld the values, equality, sovereignty, all the things that were precious to us. And just a couple of days later, on the 15th of March, 1961, South Africa left because she did not wish to believe in the equality of each of us in the Commonwealth. So it was a really poignant historical moment. And during the third phase of decolonization, known as the Wind of Change, the United Kingdom government undertook an assessment of which newly independent countries might expect to join the Commonwealth. When Cyprus gained its independence in 1960, there were, as you know, discussions of a special status category. As to admit Cyprus would, as a full member, would lead the way for 30 or so other small states to join. And Commonwealth prime ministers set up a study group of senior officials, and they eventually concluded that full membership was the principle most consistent with the aspirations of new nations and the ethos of the Commonwealth. And this has been an important expression of our Commonwealth commitments to inclusiveness, equality, and diversity amongst nations as amongst people. And it's true to say that sometimes people are very perplexed as to how can you have in one group equality between a country the size of India with 1.36 billion people and a country the size of Nauru, 11,000 people. It's been said, surely they cannot be treated equally. And the beauty of our Commonwealth is that they are. And the reason they are, I think, is because of Cyprus. So it adds greatly to the strength of our membership and collaboration and to the influence of our collective voice and global advocacy that with member nations set in every continent and ocean and at every stage of economic and social development and of hugely varying geographical size and human population, all meet on equal terms and have an equal voice. And for that, again, I say we thank Cyprus as the pioneer nation. We also thank Cyprus for hosting the first Commonwealth meeting of the Ministerial Group of Small States, which was convened in 1993 when CHOGM was held in Limassol. Now, speaking of the Cyprus CHOGM, my predecessor as Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Chief Emeka Anoko of Nigeria, said this: Harare set us on a course by reaffirming the principles by which we stand and the direction upon which we are embarked. Let Cyprus be the catalyst for releasing the energies of the Commonwealth in pursuing, through action, those principles. He was referring to the Harare Commonwealth Declaration, which was issued from the 1991 CHOGM hosted by Zimbabwe, sadly not at present a member, but you'll know that they have applied to return home. And the declaration set the Commonwealth on a new course with clearer emphasis on promoting democracy and good governance, human rights and the rule of law, gender equality and sustainable economic and social development. Building on that declaration, our shared values and principles are now brought together in the Commonwealth Charter, which was adopted by all our member countries in 2012 and signed by Her Majesty the Queen in Marlborough House in 2013. And on the common ground and foundation of commitment to those values and principles, the Commonwealth makes a unique global contribution by shining as a beacon for multilateralism. And through our interconnected networks, we sustain a vibrant ecosystem of opportunity for us to do this on a scale that is vast and global, yet very human in expression. Our great strength as a family of nations and of peoples growing together organically is our ability to evolve and adjust to changing circumstances, whether in the field of democracy, rule of law, human rights, governance, or trade. The Commonwealth we know today was inspired by the spirit and thirst for equality and justice, arising from dominion to voluntary equal partnership. Incrementally and dynamically, our shared understanding and consensual commitment has grown. 20 years before the Harare Declaration, the Singapore Declaration of Commonwealth Principles had been adopted in 1971 at the first gathering of our leaders to be designated as a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. This was built on further by heads of government in Zimbabwe in 1991 and again in 2009 in Trinidad and Tobago with the affirmation of Commonwealth values and principles. And there had also been the adoption in 2004 of the Commonwealth Latimer House principles on the harmonious balancing of power and the interaction between Parliament, the executive, and the judiciary in democratic societies. I set out this historical timeline to show the continuing and dynamic development of Commonwealth understanding and commitment by our member nations. It also shows the ability and readiness of the Commonwealth to evolve and to adapt to new circumstances. And indeed, that in the first 20 years of the 21st century, very considerable progress and positive change have already taken place. We need this now more than ever, as COVID-19 has profound impact on lives and livelihoods around the world, causing immense disruption, unsettling many of us as we find ourselves suddenly in unfamiliar and sometimes daunting territory. Financial markets have fluctuated wildly. Democratic dispensations have been challenged, and our civil and criminal justice systems have been severely strained. And the answer to these challenges is not to retreat and isolate. It is to connect and support one another. Post-pandemic social and economic healing and development cannot happen without cooperation. As a network of networks, rich in diversity, yet with shared history and inheritances, connecting widely distributed geographical locations, yet with many similarities of legislative, administrative, and regulatory systems, the Commonwealth draws together countries and communities, institutions, and individuals to connect and to cooperate across 5 regions of the world. So let us consider some of the ways in which we are utilising Commonwealth connection to collaborate on building back better and to deliver sustainable economic and social development fit for the 21st century. The impacts of the pandemic on lives and livelihoods are exacerbated for women and girls simply because of gender. Globally, job losses as a consequence of COVID-19 are much greater amongst women than men, and even more so for women of colour. We have witnessed alarmingly high instances of gender-based violence and domestic abuse. In some of our countries, it has gone up by more than 500%, but in none of our countries has it stayed the same. The pandemic threatens to roll back the hard-won progress towards gender equality that we have fought for over many, many decades. Given that 1.2 billion of the world's women are in the Commonwealth, we are more committed than ever to fight for a world that benefits all, including women and girls. Very close to my heart is the Commonwealth Says No More campaign, launched last year to tackle the rapid rise in domestic and sexual violence resulting from the impacts of COVID-19. Through it, we are providing support for governments, organisations and individuals to confront this issue through longer-term prevention strategies and support. And we're building back better through civil and criminal justice transformation. It is imperative that we include civil and criminal justice systems in our post-pandemic rebuilding efforts so that the rule of law and equal access to justice are upheld, safeguarded, and promoted. Through Commonwealth cooperation, we have supported member countries in their criminal and justice and civil justice needs throughout this pandemic in a number of ways. For example, through a project called Kulburi, that's the COVID-19 Business Law Response Initiative. We have brought together a team of pro bono legal experts who, at the request of member countries wishing to receive assistance, carry out research to assist with legislative drafting. This has been important, as Commonwealth member countries have had to review their laws to help mitigate the effects of COVID-19 on businesses and the economy, as well as on livelihoods of their people. No one expected or prepared for this pandemic, and many of our rules, justly relied on and justly implemented, if not muted, could have very harsh consequences for those businesses who, through no fault of their own, did not prepare for such a pandemic. So while we are responding to the immediate threat of the pandemic, we're also keeping sight of another existential threat: climate change. Without urgent action on how we use and steward our lands and oceans, we cannot hope to achieve the targets set out in the Paris Agreement on climate change. And given the impact of COVID-19, our countries have a narrow window of opportunity to establish a new normal for the ways in which we interact with our natural environment. Part of this must mean a deliberate and systematic focus on a green recovery that incorporates climate-smart practices in a way we grow our crops, raise livestock, and use our land resource. The pioneering Langkawi Declaration on the Environment, made as long ago as 1989, when Commonwealth leaders met in Malaysia, recognized that any delay, and that's what they said, any delay in addressing the impending climate crisis increased the existential threats to our common home, planet Earth. And it's poignant and sobering to recognize that that declaration took place years before the first COP. So we have moved a long way since then, and much more has happened, which is positive. Yet we know that time is running out, and the need to move from declaration to implementation becomes more urgent with every year that passes. We are the first generation to experience the aberrant consequences of this climate crisis. But the reality is we are also the last generation who have the opportunity to do anything about it. We may be the first generation, therefore, to truly experience the tragic consequences of the climate crisis. But because of that, we are perhaps the last to have an opportunity to take action to reverse it. And agreed unanimously by leaders in April 2018, the Commonwealth Blue Charter commits all member countries to work together on solving crucial ocean-related challenges and builds on our long-standing and pioneering engagement to address climate change since the adoption of the Langkawi Declaration. And Cyprus was with us the very first time we suggested to the world that a blue charter was possible and necessary at that very first conference on oceans in New York. And therefore, it's of real note and something that I wish to laud that the most recent initiative by Cyprus is to establish a small state centre of excellence for the promotion of marine research, development and innovation, which is truly timely and will go hand in glove with the Blue Charter's ambitions. Within the Blue Charter framework, Cyprus also champions the Action Group on Sustainable Aquaculture towards further enhancing capacity and expert exchanges in this area, particularly important to the economies of small island states, or as we would like to refer to them, big blue ocean states. So furthermore, Commonwealth leaders are poised to take a decisive action on climate issues when they next meet by the way of a pioneering Commonwealth call to action on living lands to reinforce efforts to tackle the climate crisis, land degradation and biodiversity loss as three interlinked challenges. Collectively and individually, the nations of the Commonwealth certainly face many challenges. However, there are also many opportunities to be seized and immense potential has yet to be tapped. Within the Commonwealth setting, we have the advantage of being able to survey current developments with the benefit of our 70 years of progressive engagement and positive organic growth, 60 of them with Cyprus contributing and gaining advantage as a full sovereign member. Our roots go deep and our branches spread wide. So I repeat the words of our current Commonwealth theme: delivering a common future, connecting, innovating, transforming. We carry forward in these daunting times the flame kept alight and passed to us by those who guarded it in dark days of years gone by. Always we look and work for a brighter future, and we know that we shall reach horizons of hope more surely and more swiftly with the mutual encouragement, support and strength which come from solidarity. I commend the University of Nicosia School of Law and the Royal Commonwealth Society Cyprus branch for this collaborative initiative with the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in joining with you to celebrate the golden anniversary of Cyprus being welcomed as a full member of the Commonwealth. I salute the government, institutions, and people of this nation and your commitment to the shared values and principles of our Commonwealth Charter. So many congratulations, and may the star of Cyprus continue to shine ever brighter. So thank you very much.
Your Excellency, thank you so much for the most inspiring and visionary speech. It is honestly about equal terms and equal voice. And to paraphrase Amanda Gorman's inauguration poem, The Hill We Climb, I would say that together and united, we climb the Commonwealth Hill. Thank you so much once again.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
And now we move to, I am sorry to say that Robert Holland, due to urgent personal reasons, could not be with us this evening. Therefore, it is my pleasure to introduce Philip Murphy, Director, Institute of the Commonwealth Studies, University of London, for his own keynote address and speech. My dear Philip, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me try and share my screen with you. It's taking a while. Are you able to see the
Yes.
the PowerPoint slides, please?
Yes, yes, now, yes,
Great.
of course.
Thank you very much. It's always a sort of slightly nerve-wracking part of a presentation nowadays on the online technologies. But thank you so much, Constantinos, for your introductions. Thank you, Professor Achilles Emilianides, for your overview of Cyprus and the membership of the Commonwealth. Thank you to Ben Rawlings from the UK High Commission for his introductory comments, and thanks, of course, to Baroness Patricia Scotland for setting the status and the issue of Cyprus in the context of the Commonwealth's current priorities. I'm going to circle back a little bit, and I'm no substitute for Robert Holland, who's an expert on the history of Cyprus and its relations with the UK and the Commonwealth. But what I'd really like to do is to touch on some of the points that have been raised already, both by Achilles and by Patricia Scotland, and relate them to a couple of resources, online resources, that the Institute of Commonwealth Studies provides, which we're always keen to publicize. The first is the series British Documents on the End of Empire. And this was established by the Institute of Commonwealth Studies back in 1987. And it's produced a series of country volumes and general volumes on British decolonization policy. It's very much from the British perspective. It's based on documents in the National Archives. And unfortunately, although a volume on Cyprus was planned by the organizing team, it never came to fruition. But what we do have are plenty of documents on Cyprus and British policy towards Cyprus in the general volumes of the series, which run from the 1920s to the early 1970s. And the volume that I'm going to refer to today and draw documents from is the general volume on the Conservative government at the end of Empire, 1957-64, which of course deals with the period of Cyprus's independence and its membership of the Commonwealth. And this was edited by Ronald Hyam and William Roger Lewin, published in the year 2000. And again, some of the issues that we have already been touched upon feature in these documents, and it might be interesting just to focus on them a little more clearly. Some background. This term, Commonwealth of Nations, of course, comes into common parlance from the 1880s onwards to talk about the British Empire, particularly the Empire of Settlement. It's coined by Lord Rosebery in a speech in 1884, the Commonwealth of Nations. And the relationship of Commonwealth countries and the relationship to each other and to Britain was defined in the 1920s with the Balfour Report. And it goes back to what Patricia Scotland was talking about the equality of Commonwealth members. Now, that phrase partly comes about because the British government at the time was keen not to talk about independence. The term independence was avoided at all costs right up until the 1950s. And so instead of talking about Commonwealth members being independent, the Balfour Report phrases that relationship in terms of them being, quote, autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status, in no way subordinate to one another in any aspect of the domestic or external affairs. So instead of saying they're independent from Britain, it's saying they're equal to Britain in terms of the rights of self-government and the right to organise their own external relations. And the terms of the Balfour Report are incorporated in the Statute of Westminster in 1931, which becomes the kind of founding document of the Commonwealth. And I think it's worth making another point, just in terms of preliminaries. The Commonwealth is often talked about as a British creation, but actually, ironically, in its modern form, many of its key developments happened in spite of, rather than because of, the wishes of the British government. Starting with 1949, the London Declaration, which effectively allowed India to become a republic the following year, 1950, but remain within the Commonwealth. And the formula used was that India would recognize King George VI as head of the Commonwealth. So a link to the crown was preserved. Britain very much wanted India to remain in the Commonwealth, but was reluctant about allowing a republic to be a Commonwealth member, because hitherto the crown had provided the main link between Commonwealth members. So that was an innovation which really was forced upon London by Nehru and the newly independent Indian government. The admission of Ghana, the first African state of the Commonwealth, again, the British government was lukewarm about it. It wondered whether this would sort of alter the nature of the Commonwealth Association. But Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana wanted Ghana to belong, and so Ghana was admitted. The admission of Cyprus, as we'll see in a minute, there were concerns on the part of the British government about the impact that Cyprus would have when it became clear that it wanted to apply, and when it joins in 1961, yeah, there's an acceptance of that, but certainly not part of the way the British designed the Commonwealth. And as Patricia Scotland said, that Cypriot membership pretty much coincides with the departure of South Africa, which again was very much against the wishes of the British government at the time. Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, struggled to find a way of keeping South Africa in. The Commonwealth Secretariat, which was established in 1965 and gave the Commonwealth the appearance of a contemporary international organisation for the first time. Again, this was not a British suggestion, it was a suggestion of a number of Commonwealth leaders, including Kwame Nkrumah. And the British rather feared that the creation of the Secretariat would entail them losing control over the Commonwealth, and in a sense it did. The creation of the Commonwealth Development Arm, the CFTC, in 1971, again, Britain and other major donors, states like Canada and Australia, were rather lukewarm about this development. It was very much the creation of the then Commonwealth Secretary General, Arnold Smith. And even the decision to admit Mozambique in 1995, the first Commonwealth state not to have been part of what you would broadly call the British Empire. Again, the British weren't altogether certain that this was a good idea. It was very much the idea of the South African government under Nelson Mandela, because of the aid that Mozambique had given to the ANC over so many years. So that's to say that the admission of Cyprus into the Commonwealth was one of a number of developments that the British government itself was somewhat lukewarm about. Wasn't altogether certain that this was a good idea. And we're looking at the reasoning for that. Again, from the British government view. What is interesting is, with a real continuing purpose of the Commonwealth, who raised the same sort of question, how can we make it work? A quotation from a memo by the senior British official at the time, Norman Brooke, the Cabinet Secretary, in 1962, shortly after Cyprus joins, raising this question. He says, what is the significance and purpose of the Commonwealth in the years ahead? There was a time when they were united by their allegiance to the common crown. We mentioned that. In the 30s, after the Ottawa Conference, there was a period when it seems possible they could form an independent economic unit, but this possibility has been progressively eroded, not by the United Kingdom, but by the economic development of the other members. Later, it could be said for a time that they all had in common a way of life based on parliamentary democracy and the common law. But the logic of events in Pakistan and Ghana and the possible course of constitutional development elsewhere have made it necessary to mute this claim. Now it's difficult to find any factor common to them all, save the use of the English language and the fact that they were once parts of the British Empire. Well, of course, with the admission of Cyprus in 1961, here was a country that was not primarily Anglophone. So even that common factor identified by Norman Brooke was called into question. And you can see from the documents in the Hyman Louis volume of British documents on the end of empire, the Conservative governments, the kinds of doubts and conversations that the British government were having behind closed doors in 1960-61. Here is Prime Minister Harold Macmillan talking in the Cabinet Colonial Policy Committee in April 1960. He notes that Cypriot leaders had requested that Cyprus be accorded full Commonwealth membership, and that this had brought into question the future character of the Commonwealth Association. Firstly, because of its relatively small population, which Achilles has already mentioned, first small state, made it, Macmillan said, a marginal candidate for membership. But in addition, Cyprus would have a special treaty relationship with Greece and Turkey, which, by giving those countries a right of intervention, would to some extent qualify its independence. could Cyprus in this situation play full part in the councils of the Commonwealth? And would its admission tend to destroy the present concept of Commonwealth association? One of the other problems was the precedent that it would set. And again, this has been touched upon in some of the earlier remarks by Achilles and also by Patricia Scotland. This was a paper that was submitted to the Cabinet Colonial Policy Committee. It says if we admitted Cyprus, we should find it difficult to deny full membership to other territories which had comparable populations and were ripe for independence. And although the prime ministers of an independent Commonwealth of 16 countries, the number already foreseen, could confer effectively together, the addition of a number of small territories would make free consultation between all member countries difficult or impossible. Perhaps the solution would be to concede the title of Commonwealth membership with the privileges of joint consultation on economic and educational questions through the established machinery to all territories which qualify for self-government, but to restrict to the larger countries the right of representation at the meetings of Commonwealth prime ministers. So there was a sense that what was special about Commonwealth meetings was that it was a relatively small number of prime ministers who could discuss issues in an informal way. If you created too large an association, those sorts of consultations would be difficult. So why not create different levels of Commonwealth membership? Well, one of the problems is that as we've already seen, the principle of equality of Commonwealth members had always been key. That would run against that principle. You can see the way that Cyprus changed the nature of the Commonwealth. Up until that point, the smallest of the Commonwealth countries, as Achilles has already mentioned, was New Zealand, with 2.5 million people. And of course, India, with at the time 397.5 million people, dwarfed everyone else. But again, the British saw value in India joining in terms of its great power status. Still had delusions in the late 40s that the Indian army might be some sort of asset to British power, but didn't quite see the point of a lot of small states joining the Commonwealth. What benefit would that bring Great Britain, or indeed the Commonwealth Association? That was the debate in Whitehall at the time. And you can see that, again, this idea that Cyprus would possibly set a precedent for other smaller territories. It's interesting, the other territories which are mentioned in this 1960 document, Western Samoa, which becomes independent in 1962, becomes independent from New Zealand, only joins the Commonwealth in 1970, and only joins the United Nations in 1976. And British Guyana, which becomes independent in 1966. Achilles mentioned this interesting innovation in the case of Cyprus, of having a kind of 5-year trial period. That's quite unusual in the history of the Commonwealth. It wasn't really elsewhere. Although British Guyana, interestingly, had a clause in the Constitution which allowed its leaders to rethink their association with the monarchy, not with the Commonwealth, but specifically with the monarchy, after a period of 4 years. And that option was taken up, and indeed, although British Guyana became independent as a monarchy under the Crown in 1966, in 1970 it became a republic, but remained within the Commonwealth. So that's a sort of an interesting point of comparison with some other Commonwealth nations. Again, we talked about the idea that is floated in 1960 of different sorts of membership of the Commonwealth. You can see this document, Patricia Scotland referred to this group, the study group, which was established by the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in May 1960. Thinking about different forms of membership, statehood, limiting principles. But one of the reasons that the committee came down against this, again, partly because of the principle of equality, which is key to the Commonwealth Association, but also to the ill will that it might create. If newly independent states wanted to join but were refused full membership. The report says these different forms of status all contain the danger that presented with the alternatives of remaining in the Commonwealth with something less than the full privileges of membership, or leaving the Commonwealth to become an independent foreign state. Most of the possible aspirants for independence within the Commonwealth might opt for the latter course. So, in a sense, what would one lose really by not giving all newly independent states full membership? Well, one probably wouldn't lose very much, and not doing that would risk creating poor relations with from the outset with newly independent states. And this is really where the cabinet comes down by July 1960. That if Cyprus wishes to become a Commonwealth member, it would be unwise to refuse it membership. There's an interesting point here. This is, again, the cabinet discussion on this in July 1960. The minutes say, so far as the United Kingdom government was concerned, a decision by an independent Cyprus to remain within the Commonwealth would be a final vindication of the government's recent policy in respect of Cyprus. For this reason, it was likely that the majority of government supporters in Parliament would favour the admission of Cyprus to Commonwealth membership. This is a rather interesting point. I'm sure that the deputies in Cyprus didn't see their desire to join the Commonwealth as a vindication of British government policy there. But the British government were able to represent that as, a sign that, well, Britain hadn't done too badly in Cyprus. They still want to belong to the Commonwealth. And you still often see that argument used. Well, if Britain was such a dreadful colonial master, why do all of these countries want to remain in the Commonwealth? It's not a particularly persuasive argument, but it's interesting to see that it was one that was used as early as 1960. One final point really on this issue of Cyprus joining. Again, it raised questions about what was it that was really holding the Commonwealth together. And there's a document included in the Hyman Louis volume called The British Legacy and the Intangible Links of the Commonwealth Association. And it goes through a number of different factors which had served to unite the Commonwealth, from the democratic ideal, the judicial system, language, education, the professions, science, the churches, sport, the arts, and so forth. And even in 1960, and again, you still see this argument used, the idea that those links were a diminishing asset, and particularly the British legacy. But I think it's very interesting to see what this document says about language. because you would imagine that, again, Cyprus joining the Commonwealth would raise questions about the idea of the Commonwealth being united by a common language. But actually, the document looks at it from a different angle. It says language barriers are also beginning to appear, not because English is dying out as lingua franca in the Commonwealth, but because we are losing our former ability to speak Oriental and African languages. Quite interesting that, again, as early as 1960, there's a sense that Britain is losing out because Britain is no longer multilingual, and that political leaders and civil servants certainly aren't. I want to go just to a final point, and picking up on a second form of information and evidence that the Institute of Commonwealth Studies makes available. Thinking about, particularly Britain and the Commonwealth over the previous decades, one can see, I suppose, a number of different high points and low points. 1950s, when the Commonwealth was really central to the UK. 1960s to the 1980s, a sort of falling off of tangible benefits of membership. Southern Africa, the issue of Rhodesia and South Africa dominating the Commonwealth agenda, and actually making the Commonwealth meetings quite uncomfortable for many British politicians. Then in the early 1990s, a kind of re-engagement by the British government around a values-based model, the values that Patricia Scotland was talking about: democracy, human rights, the rule of law. And then from, I suppose, the late 1990s, British governments from Tony Blair onwards, rather beginning to lose interest in the Commonwealth. And it's interesting the role of the 1993 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Cyprus in that process, because now one can see the British government papers from that period, from the early to mid 1990s, indeed right up to 1997 now, in the British Public Record Office. And we in the Institute of Commonwealth Studies also carried out between 2012 and 2015 a major oral history project, and conducted about 70 interviews with Commonwealth Prime Ministers, Foreign Ministers, Commonwealth Secretary Generals. And again, like the British documents on the End of Empire project, all of those materials are available via our website. Here's John Major, former British Prime Minister John Major, being interviewed in 2018 about the 1993 Heads of Government meeting. And Sue Onslow interviewing him mentions that he hadn't really mentioned Cyprus and the Cyprus meeting in 1993. And he sort of says, well, it doesn't stick in my memory very clearly 30 years later. Limassol was important in the sense it provided us with a backdrop and an opportunity to discuss how important trade changes were in the Commonwealth. That the Uruguay round was very much the subject of conversation. But there wasn't a specific or memorable issue compared to Nigeria or Harare in 1991 in order to place it in my memory. The Cyprus Heads of Government meeting fell between two quite important summits: 1991, the Harare Declaration on Commonwealth Principles, and 1995, when the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group was established, largely as a consequence of human rights violations in Nigeria at the time. And it's interesting that the Major didn't quite remember Cyprus very well. he says, I mean, the success of these meetings sometimes depends on whether there's something big that needs to be decided. And when one goes from the interviews to the British documents that are now available in the National Archives, you can see that even before the Limassol meeting took place earlier in October 1993, just before heads were beginning to meet together, Downing Street and the British government were worried that there really wasn't enough to discuss at the meeting, and wondered whether there was any point in these meetings happening so frequently, every 2 years. A Major wrote to the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jim Bolger, who was due to host the 1995 meeting, suggesting that one variant would be for heads to meet every 4 years, alternating with foreign ministers who would meet every 4 years. My main reason for wanting to set such an experiment in motion is to avoid perpetuating meetings every 2 years, which are too hollow to carry conviction, and which are a heavy demand on our time. And indeed, following that meeting and coming up to the 1995 Heads of Government meeting, Downing Street, you can see here from a couple of a memo by one of the Downing Street officials, is worried that, again, there just won't be enough worthwhile to discuss. If the Prime Minister is to spend the better part of the week going to and from the 1995 CHOCM, he'd like to feel that there was a demonstrable return on his investment, and indeed on the substantial sums of money which the UK continues to invest in the Commonwealth. He'd like us to think of imaginative ways of using this unusual organisation in which we profess to believe is sort of an interesting phrase there. So I'm sorry to sort of end on a sort of a slightly downbeat note here. I think interesting that the membership of Cyprus in 1961 has a very important role in fixing the shape of the Commonwealth. As Patricia Scotland said, as an organisation now composed of small states, the majority of them being small states. But that 1993 meeting points to a dilemma in the organisation now of maybe having too many things on the agenda, but nothing that actually requires a huge meeting. And you've seen, as a consequence of that in recent years, certainly before the 2018 meeting, heads of government simply be reluctant to these meetings. Again, because they don't feel it's necessarily a good use of their time. It certainly wasn't, as I've tried to point out, the fault of Cyprus in 1993 that it fell in that period when the British government didn't feel there was an awful lot to discuss. But it is a problem with the way in which Commonwealth heads of government continue to be framed. Leave it at that and hand back over to the organisers. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Philip, for the most interesting historical account of Cyprus' membership to the Commonwealth. It was very informative. And on this note, I would like to thank from my heart Philip Murphy for your excellent presentation, Achilles Emilianides for his, it was a trip down memory lane. Of course, I thank Ben Rawlings, who is no longer with us, the Deputy High Commissioner of the United Kingdom in Cyprus. And last but not least, Her Excellency Patricia Scotland for the most visionary and inspiring speech, which was reiterated the spirit of Commonwealth, which in my eyes, it is about equal terms and equal voice. there is a sense of hope and a sense of optimism after tonight's conference opening ceremony. And I thank all the participants for attending the opening ceremony. We very much look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 10:30. From myself and the organizing committee, have a beautiful evening. Thank you so much.